Okay, so our first topic is the human body and orientation. And this basically provides us an overview of some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about throughout anatomy and physiology. So, to start with, we pull out basically three very basic concepts, and these are essential to the study of A&P. And the first one being this whole idea of complementarity. So we have a relationship between the structure, the anatomical structure of our body, and what those structures are able to do or what type of function they're able to perform. The second concept is this idea that we have a hierarchy of structural organization, and we're going to talk through that. And then the third concept that is pervasive throughout all of anatomy and physiology is that of homeostasis, or this state of dynamic equilibrium within our body. So anatomy and physiology are complementary branches of science that help to explain the structure and the function of the human body. So when we look at structure, we look at the actual physical anatomy of the body, whether it's the skeletal system. I've got on here some different joints that are highlighted, and if you look at your elbow, moving your elbow up and down, the joint that's formed there is called a hinge joint. It does a certain type of motion, and that's the type of joint form determines the function that that joint is able to perform. And so we see examples of complementarity throughout anatomy and physiology. So when we tease out individual components of it, anatomy is very concrete. It's the structures that you can palpate, and that's a fancy word for feel or touch with your fingers. And being a physical therapist, that has been very important to me in my practice, just the ability to palpate structures on my patients, and then to even picture in my mind, where are those structures, what's their 3D relationship with other structures around them, and being able to keep that in mind and picture it in my head from having learned it first, from a textbook. The second part of A&P deals with physiology. And so this is taking those concrete anatomical structures and saying, how do they function? How do all of these structures work together to keep us alive and to allow us to do all the amazing things that we can do every day? So when we look at anatomy, we can either we can look at a couple different aspects of it. So we can say gross anatomy, and that's basically primarily what we're dealing with here, although we do start with some little bit of cytology, a little bit of cells, and a little bit of tissue. So we do move into a little bit of histology, but the grand majority of what we're going to be doing is gross anatomy. And so these are big picture structures that you can see with the naked eye. And then microscopic anatomy would be diving in a little deeper, more on the cellular or tissue level. And then in terms of physiology, we basically take organs of the body and we can kind of put them together into organ systems. And so we're going to have like the respiratory system involving the lungs and all the respiratory tract. Or we have a cardiovascular system, which is going to include the heart and all the blood vessels. So we take separate organs and we can combine them together to create an organ system. And the whole function of that organ system is to perform a role in the body. So talking a little bit more about complementarity. So we can look at this relationship between structure and function and say that, okay, the function of a particular part of the body is always reflected in the structure or how that particular anatomy is created. So what a structure is able to do, what function it serves, is dependent on how it's made. It's dependent on its anatomy. So some examples of this, like in terms of the skeletal system, how's our skeletal system made? Without even knowing anything about anatomy, you know that bones are hard, right? And we have muscles that attach to bones. and that allows you to move. And so what would happen if our bones were really soft? Like, how would we move if our bones were not as hard as they are? Well, fortunately for us, our bones are made in a certain way so that they can do the function that we need them to do. So bones are hard because they're protective, right? Your skull's protective, it protects your brain. And that makes sense, and that's a great example of complementarity. And then other bones in our arms and our legs, they're hard, and they provide like a rigid structure for our muscles to attach to, so that when our muscles pull on our bones, we're able to move. The shape of your teeth, that's another great example of complementarity. So if we look at teeth, we've got these incisors in the front of our mouth, and these guys are sharp. They've got kind of a sharp edge, and so they're great for like biting and tearing off food. The teeth in the back, the molars that we have that are more towards the back of the mouth, are kind of flat on top, and so they are more important for like grinding food. And then red blood cells. So without even knowing anything about the cardiovascular system, just off the top of your head, what do you think red blood cells do for us in the blood? So they're important for oxygen transport. But what's interesting is that red blood cells don't actually use up any of the oxygen that they carry. So red blood cells generate ATP through anaerobic pathways. Anaerobic meaning they don't require oxygen. So all that oxygen that they're carrying, they're able to carry to their target tissue, and they're not burning it up the whole way using it for energy. So this hierarchy of structural organization. So this is what we see in the body, and we see these different levels of structural organization. So we basically range from the beginning, from the most simple structure of chemicals, which are going to combine to create cells. Cells combine to create tissue in the body. Different types of tissues are going to combine to create organs like the heart and the liver and the brain. And then we'll have multiple organs that are all working together to perform the same function, and they combine as an organ system. Now, what we see in the body is that multiple organ systems are going to combine to create the whole organism. And that's what we see here. So now we're down to the organismal, or actually we're up to the organismal level, and we're looking at the organism as a whole. So we're basically going from a very simple level to a much more complex level here. And so this is just kind of a visual representation of that information, going from chemical to cellular to tissue, multiple tissues coming together to create organs, multiple organs coming together to create an organ system like the cardiovascular system, and then all of these different organ systems come together to create the whole person or the organism. And what we see is this relationship between organ systems. So our body doesn't operate in isolation, meaning that all of the different organ systems in our body typically work together to carry out processes that span, for instance, digestive system, respiratory system, urinary system, and integumentary system. All of those are working together so that our body can function like we need to. So here are some examples. Well, here's your list of organ systems in the body. And you can read through those. What's important to know at this point is just big picture functions. And you've got all of that in these slides in terms of each individual system, and then general functions, as well as the specific components of each organ system. So these are basically highlighting all the organ systems that we're going to be talking about in A&P. And this is just kind of a broad overview of all of them. So when we talk about requirements for life, like what do we need to do to sustain our life? What are some examples of factors that we need to be able to carry out? So these would be all considered to be necessary life functions in order to um, maintain our life. Let's talk through a few of these. So first one, maintaining boundaries. And basically, this is important in a few different ways. So number one, we want to basically control access, whether it's access to our body as a whole or access to individual cells. So we have plasma membranes in our cells that form a barrier or a boundary to separate, intercellular fluid on the inside of the cell from extracellular fluid on the outside. Okay, so we've got boundaries not only on a cellular level, but then if you think about it, we have a boundary even as we look at a whole person. So your skin is a boundary, and it's going to control movement of substances that have access to our interior. So what would happen if we spent all day with our skin so porous and so open that anything we came into contact with could be absorbed into our body? So that would be terrible. It would have terrible repercussions. And that's not at all what happens. So skin is very protective and it forms this boundary. So we want to be able to maintain our internal environment separate from our external environment. And we do that both on a cellular level as well as the organism as a whole. Movement. So this can happen in a couple different formats. So we can think movement of our person as a whole. So we've got skeletal muscles that are going to help to move us, and they help us manipulate our environment and do what we need to do. These muscles are going to hold us up against gravity. We have our cardiovascular system. So you can picture the heart pumping and it's going to propel that blood through the blood vessels. We have the digestive system, and the digestive system tract is responsible for moving food through our body, and then it's responsible also for moving all that undigestible waste product out of our body. Responsiveness. So this is our body's ability to sense changes and respond to it. And this is very important. This is very protective. So think about touching something hot, like if you touch a hot stove, and the fact that your body reacts reflexively to pull your hand away from that stove before you're burned, or hopefully so that you're not burned terribly. So your conscious awareness of the heat actually comes after your muscles have contracted and have moved your hand away from that hot stove. So we're very responsive, and that's very protective and serves us well. We call this responsiveness irritability, and we don't mean like you're getting hangry irritability. It's a good kind of irritability, or even excitability. So you'll see that referenced a couple different ways. So typically, our responsiveness tends to come from our nervous system, but we also have other cells that respond to stimuli in different ways as well. Digestion. And so this is the process of breaking down food into these simpler components or simpler molecules that our body can actually use for energy and for building blocks. So this is performed by the digestive system. So we have our digestive tract. And this is a great example of how we have this relationship between different organ systems, because our digestive system is responsible for absorbing the nutrients, but then those nutrients are actually going to be absorbed into our bloodstream and are going to be taken back to the heart so that they can be pumped out to the rest of the body. Metabolism. And so metabolism is basically the combined chemical reactions that occur within all of our body cells. And so different things happen here. So we not only have complex cellular structures that are broken down into more simple ones, but we also have a building up of simple structures, of combining those simple structures into more complex cellular structures. So metabolism can be anabolic as well as catabolic, and it also involves the process of using nutrients and oxygen to generate ATP, which is going to be used throughout our body as an energy source. Metabolism tends to be regulated by hormones, which are chemical messengers secreted by the endocrine system. Excretion, which is the process of getting rid of substances that our body doesn't need. So we have waste products from digestion, and we have metabolic waste products that our body just doesn't need to hold on to. So we're going to excrete those byproducts. And we're going to do that a few different ways. So we had already talked about this before. The digestive tract is a pretty good means of getting rid of non-digestible food products that our body doesn't need to hold on to. We have metabolic waste products like urea and uric acid that our body is able to excrete through the urinary system. And then carbon dioxide is actually a metabolic waste product, and our body is able to breathe out excess carbon dioxide through the lungs every time we exhale. Reproduction. So reproduction happens on two levels. We have not only a cellular reproduction, where we have the initial cell, which is going to then divide into two identical daughter cells. So that's happening on a cellular level. And then we also have organismal reproduction. And so what happens here is we are able to form reproductive cells that are going to form a union and result in the reproduction of that person. So it's basically going to, the union of those cells are going to ultimately form a whole new individual. Growth. So growth has to happen in our body. So we can either talk about growth in terms of the size of individual body parts, or we can look at growth of the organism as an entire person. So this is what happens when we have an increase in number of cells when cells divide. We can also see an increase in size of cells, and this is what happens. Let's say you decide you're going to take up weightlifting as your hobby, and you're hitting the gym pretty hard, and you pack on 20 pounds of muscle. So all of those skeletal muscle cells, we actually don't create new muscle cells when that happens, but what happens is the cells that we have get bigger. So we end up increasing the size of cells, and that's an example of growth. So it is important to note that in order for growth to occur, we have to have constructive activities, which means building things up. We can also call that anabolic. Anabolic activities have to happen at a faster rate than we're deconstructing our cells or breaking them down. So cellular deconstruction would also be catabolic. Okay, so basically what this means is that we're constantly building up and breaking down. That happens normally throughout our body. But in order for growth to occur, we have to have the building up activity happen at a greater rate than our breaking down activity. Okay, requirements for life. So, what are things that we need in order to stay alive? Well, the first thing is nutrients. And so nutrients are what we ingest in our diet, and this is what you can think of as like vitamins and fat and protein and carbohydrates. And they do all different types of roles for us in our body. These are the chemical substances that are broken down in our digestive system and form building blocks of things that we need for energy and also cellular repair and construction within our body. Oxygen. So we are highly dependent on oxygen. There are not many cells in our body that can live without oxygen for very long. So our atmosphere, thankfully, is about 21% oxygen, and we're able to bring it into our body through our respiratory system. So most chemical reactions in our body require oxygen, and we call them oxidative reactions. Water. Water is very important. Our body is mostly water. It accounts for about 50 to 60% of our total body weight. And water is actually the most abundant chemical in our body. We are able to obtain water through the food that we eat and the liquid that we drink. However, our body is constantly losing water through either evaporation on our skin or through excretion through urinary or digestive tract. Our body temperature. So body temperature is really important. We need to maintain a certain amount or a certain level of body temperature. And we can have mild fluctuations, but we shouldn't really have significant fluctuations in our body temperature. Typical body temperature is about 98.6, although some research shows that it actually fluctuates a little more than that and can still be very normal. If our body temperature is too low, then physiological processes within our body slow down to the point where they're no longer effective. And if our body temperature is too high, then it actually starts to break down the proteins in our body, and that's not good either. Our body temperature is maintained through our skeletal muscles because they generate heat every time they contract. Atmospheric pressure. So atmospheric pressure is basically the pressure of the air around you pushing down on you. Okay? And so what happens is we have this exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide, and it is entirely dependent on atmospheric pressure. So we need to have that atmospheric pressure in order to drive oxygen from the atmosphere into our lungs and into our bloodstream to be circulated throughout our body. And then on the flip side, we need to get rid of carbon dioxide, so we have pressure gradients between carbon dioxide in our body and outside the body that's going to drive movement of carbon dioxide out of our body so that we can get rid of it. Okay, so this brings us to homeostasis. So homeostasis, this is our body's ability to maintain a relatively stable internal environment, even though the world outside of our body is constantly changing. So this really doesn't mean that we don't change at all, because we do have some changes. It just means that we are what we call in a dynamic state of equilibrium. So we do have some change in our internal conditions, but they're not significant, or we try to minimize how much change is going on. So the way that we are able to maintain homeostasis in our internal environment is through control systems. And so we have some different terms that are involved in the control system. So let's talk about those a little bit. The variable. So the variable is the factor or event being regulated, like body temperature or blood glucose levels. The receptor is going to be a sensor that's going to monitor the environment. It's going to respond to a change in the variable, like a change in blood glucose levels or a change in body temperature. And it's going to convey that information along an afferent pathway that's going to travel up to the control center. Okay? And so what we see here is the control center is basically has a predetermined set point for that variable, whatever variable it is. And it's going to take the information from the receptor and compare it to the set point. And then depending on how that comparison turns out, it's going to decide on a response. Now, the control center is going to send information through the efferent pathway to an effector. Now, if you look at the word effector, it basically looks like effect. And so this is what we have here. The effector is typically going to be a muscle or a gland. And it's going to exert an effect based on what the control center tells it to do. Okay, so here it is. The effector carries out the control center's response to the stimulus. It has an effect. Okay, so the result of the response, what happens here, tends to feed back to either reduce the effect of the stimulus, which is what we see when we have a negative feedback loop. It shuts it off, or it's going to increase the effect of the stimulus, which is going to be further enhancing the effect of the stimulus, which is what we call positive feedback. Now, our body tends to operate in negative feedback loops. Negative feedback loops in the human body are much more common than positive feedback loops. So when in doubt, negative feedback loop, because that's typically what we see. But this is kind of an example, or this is taking those individual terms and showing you how they're arranged a little more visually. Let's talk through an example. So here's a couple examples of negative feedback loops. So one example of negative feedback loop would be body temperature regulation. Another one would be blood sugar control. So here's our negative feedback loop. And let's go through, let's say that we have cold, okay? Let's say that we're outside in the winter and our body gets really cold. So our stimulus is cold, and what happens is it causes our body temperature to decrease, okay? So receptors are going to detect that decrease in our body temperature and convey that information along our afferent pathway to the control center. And in this case, that's going to be an area of your brain that's responsible for regulating body temperature. The control center is going to compare that body temperature to your set normal body temperature of 98.6, and it's going to say, oh, our body temperature is too low. We need to do something about that. So it's going to activate the efferent pathway to send a message to an effector, which we already said before has an effect. And effectors tend to be muscles or glands. And in this case, it's going to, our effector is going to be skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles are going to shiver. That's what happens when we get cold, right? Skeletal muscles contract and shivering starts. And so when skeletal muscles contract, they generate body heat. So the response to our effector is that our body temperature is going to rise. And once our body temperature rises back up to that 98.6, then this whole process here is going to end up shutting off. And that's the negative feedback, because once we get back up to normal, the whole cycle is going to shut off. Okay, so what we see with positive feedback mechanism is that the result further enhances the original stimulus, so the response is accelerated. So as opposed to the previous example, when the body temperature rises to a certain level, it actually shuts off the whole cycle. What happens with positive feedback is it continues to enhance the cycle. And so we see positive feedback, again, only in a couple different instances. Most processes in the body operate through negative feedback. But one example of positive feedback is blood clotting. And so what we see with this is if you have a tear in the wall of your blood vessel, that tear is going to attract platelets that are circulating in the bloodstream, and they're going to adhere to the tear in the blood vessel. And when they do that, they're going to release chemicals that are going to attract other circulating platelets to the area. So those chemicals attract more platelets. Those additional platelets adhere to the tear and release more chemicals. More chemicals attract more platelets. So you can see how, this cycle through here is showing you this positive feedback loop. Okay, eventually it does shut off. It doesn't continue indefinitely, but once that tear is completely covered and we form what's called a platelet plug, then it actually shuts it off. So it does eventually shut off. It's the same oxytocin with childbirth. Oxytocin is a hormone that's released from the pituitary gland in your brain, and during childbirth, the pressure of the baby's head on the cervix causes the brain to release more oxytocin. Oxytocin travels to the uterus and increases strength of contraction, which further pushes the baby down into the birth canal. That's another example of a positive feedback loop, but it does eventually shut off because eventually the baby's born and then the whole process is done. So those are both examples of positive feedback loops.